I'm Mike Rogers. I'm a home brewer. I've also brewed professionally for a small stint for a craft brewery in Florida called Darwin's. I've brewed for roughly 18 plus years. Over that time, I brewed every kind of style you could think of. I've become very fond of a certain kind of style, more farmhouse, saison, styles in that kind of vein, and that is what I'll be doing today. I have to heat the water high enough to compensate for the amount of heat that is absorbed by the grain when it's added. So I end up heating the water to, I want to say 163.7. And from there, a lot of that heat is absorbed into the grain. And then it should stabilize at roughly 152 degrees. And that's the temperature that it mashes at for conversion into fermentable starches. Now, the kettle that the grain's steeped in has a screen at the bottom to keep the liquid separate. So what I'm doing here is preheating the mashton, and then I'll slowly add in the grains, which is referred to as going in.
What got you into home brewing?
Ironically enough, I had never given any thought to it whatsoever. I got a gift one year, a homebrew kit that came with like a small kind of, I think, an amber or a brown ale style recipe with all the ingredients, stuck them together. It came out fantastic. After doing that, I was hooked. I loved beer before, never would have thought I could have brewed. It was a complete surprise.
Going in?
Going in, yeah. I think the terminology in relation to bread never stayed far away from each other.
What is the most challenging aspect of home brewing?
I think for everybody that's going to be different. Sometimes your expectations are your worst enemy. You want to make beer that's the same quality as the commercial beers you're familiar with. You start out with these are the targets you aim for, and when you fall short, you can be pretty critical of yourself. Though I have known many homebrewers that I thought brewed to every bit the same quality and level that you get from a commercial brewery, by far. Sometimes better so. Some amazing, amazing beer can come out from a home brewing environment. And it may look like a coincidental amount of liquid, but if I fill it right to the top of the graphic, 1 quart of water.
Oh.
So I am actually measuring this as I go. The volume of strike water added to the grain is important because that's part of the calculation on achieving the right dough-in temperature. So from here, I'm making sure that all of the grain is thoroughly wet. I will keep adding water as I add grain. I don't want to add all the grain at one time, with the potential that I would have dry pockets inside of the grain potential areas that the enzyme activity would never be activated. Now in this process, this step right here, I am calculating the water temperature to be slightly higher than the mash temperature I want to have, because the grains and the kettle, the container itself, the mash tun, will absorb some of the heat from the water. I guess we're using that spot right there. Now this step here is not technically an ingredient in the sense that the other ones are. They're rice hulls. They don't contribute anything to the beer itself. They serve a function of leaving some physical space in between the grain. That's not necessary for most beer recipes, but this recipe has a high percentage of rye malt, which tends to produce a much stickier
much starchier mash while it's converting, and I can turn this cereal mash right here into almost an oatmeal consistency, so thick that the water can't pass through it, which is referred to as a stuck mash, in which case I can't rinse the fermentable sugars free from the grain during the next step. So rice hulls are added to all of the grain to the mash, just to serve as hopefully a way around having a stuck mash later. So this is still very thick. There's not enough liquid added to this yet. Still more just hydrating all of the grain as it's going. Once we get the correct amount of liquid added, then mashes for roughly an hour, hour and a half. And then during that time, enzyme activity converts the starches into fermentable sugars.
So is homebrewing legal?
So technically, yes, it's federally legal in every state, though the federal government allows individual states to set their own regulations. So there are limitations in some states. In North Carolina, it is completely legal for personal use, which means I can't sell the homebrew I have, but I'm more than able to invite you over and share any of what I make.
And if I'm lucky, I hit this temperature exactly on the first try. That does not happen every time. Sometimes I have to do minor adjustments to the final temperature. I might have to add a percentage of warmer water. I might have to add even a small percentage of cooler water to lower the temperature a couple of degrees. But if and when it finally stabilizes at an ideal temperature, then we pretty much hurry up and wait. That's when we can prep and do lots of other work that we need for the next stages. I typically sanitize my fermentation equipment, that kind of thing. Take a break, go have a sandwich. Let's test our target temperature, see where we're at. And this is the moment of truth. Or the moment of crying. It looks to me like we had just enough downtime in between chasing down kettles and that kind of stuff that I'm probably going to fall under my target temperature, in which case I will have to resort to boiling a small portion of water and adding that back to this to raise it the additional amount I need to. So if I'm targeting 152 and I'm still climbing slowly, I'm at 140. I'm guessing that I'm going to fall short of that 152. So I will start boiling a quart of water or so on the stove inside, and see if we can adjust that right up to the temperature. In the meantime, I'll put the lid on it so I'm not losing heat to the inside, and we'll see what we got to do.
How much space would you say you need to set up a good home brew?
So there's a lot of answers to that question. You can do it in the most minimalistic one-bedroom apartment in a basement somewhere and still make excellent beer. You could, depending on the system and scale that you like to brew at. You can also set up something that takes up your entire garage. You have a lot of flexibility there.
I pulled off some liquid from the bottom, heated it back up, boiling, added it back to the top, stirred it back in. That gradually raised the temperature to my target temperature. And now we wait.
What equipment do you need?
That all depends on what you would like to do. The basic things you need: a boil kettle and something to ferment. What you'll see here is this is a 5-gallon fermenter. I will add the wort to that later, and I will ferment beer in that. You can use that. Even a lot of entry-level kits use a plastic bucket. Those were very easy to learn and get used to. I prefer both. I actually toggle back and forth between the two all the time.
iodine test gives me a little bit of an indication of how thorough the conversion process is. If the iodine stays red, the sugars are still partially converted. If the iodine turns dark, which it did almost immediately, that shows that I have a full conversion of the starches in the wort. Let me know that that is ready to move on to the next step. I'm actually letting the grains compact slowly, and what that will do, I'll pour this back in and do this a couple of times. That lets the grain bed settle, and the grain will actually do the job of filtering particulates from the liquid at a certain stage.
Can I make cider using this same process?
You can do a whole range of things. I make cider just as much as I do beer. The only difference is cider is substantially easier to do, has considerably fewer steps. But I use the exact same yeast that I use for the beer I make, and I make cider right beside that I think is fantastic.
For here, I will start to drain the wort from the grain. The water that I have here is my sparge water. I'm going to use that to replenish the water that I'm draining, or the wort, so that I keep at least an inch of liquid above the surface of the grain inside the mash tun. And one thing for sure, it is not a science and art reserved for men only. I know women who make fantastic beer. Just as good, maybe sometimes better, than most of the men that I know that make beer. So, women, don't hesitate. Now, one thing that isn't obvious here, I am adding water to eventually capture a certain volume. I will lose some during the boiling process through evaporation. So I will capture a slightly larger volume than I will have when I am done. And it doesn't look like I am measuring that, but I am using a visual indicator inside the kettle. It tells me that is my mark. All different beer styles essentially come from a couple basic grains. All of the different colors that you see in all of those different beer styles are all a result from how much the individual grains are toasted. A heavier, darker toast or roasting will result in a darker beer color and a more robust, everywhere from caramel style caramelized sugar flavors all the way into the roasted, acrid, burnt coffee kind of flavors, depending on how much that grain is roasted. And that contributes and results in every single kind of flavor and color that you see in all the different styles of beer available. This is obviously a lighter color beer, closer to a blonde color, more traditional of a French or Belgian saison, and that pretty much is rounding out Now I will shut that off here. There is still liquid in the grain. Now beforehand, before we started to drain the liquid from it, the grain is very, very sweet, like syrupy sweet. Now it will have hardly any flavor at all because we've effectively rinsed all of the fermentable sugars in that liquid from the grain, and we'll move those over to the burner and start heating this again for its boil process, in which case we will add the hops and all of the other miscellaneous ingredients. From there, I will turn the burner on again. And then we wait. So this is my pre-boil gravity test. I aim at a certain number here to determine the final outcome of alcohol in the beer that I'm making. So I'm aiming at a 7% alcohol saison, but I'll boil that down to condense that number until it reaches my target number. So I'll take another reading again at the end of my boil time to check how close I am to that final number. Then I take as I drain off all the wort and add my yeast, I'll check that number over the course of a week against the new number, and the difference between those two will actually tell me what percentage of alcohol it's achieved and how close it is to finishing its fermentation.
So my wort that we pulled earlier is now heated up and is beginning to boil. I'll add my first hop addition. This is my bittering hop addition. This will be East Kent Goldings. I'm adding 1 ounce at 60 minutes, and I'm putting that in a nice little sock to keep the hop particulate from ending up in the final beer. Just makes it a little bit easier for the next steps, and I'm going to add that to the wort now.
So these are in fact repurposed handlebars. There you go, our first edition of bittering hop. And then we'll give that roughly 30 minutes. And then I'll pull that out and add my next addition. The next one, Motika, which is more of a New World hop. Even though a saison is a very traditional farmhouse style beer, this is definitely a New World spin on that same kind of style. So a little bit stronger than it would have been traditionally brewed, aiming at 7%, and then the Motika hops give it a new, more unique New World spin on the tradition.
Next addition will be 1 ounce of Motika, and that I will do at 30 minutes. So some things that changed over time, details that I thought had the biggest impact on how I made beer. Really simple things, but had a profound change. So there's basic math that it all works on. You're gonna boil your beer or your wort for 60 minutes. You're gonna add your bitter hops at 60 minutes. You're gonna add them again at 30 minutes for your flavoring hops. And you're gonna add your last addition of hops just for the aroma. And that's been the traditional way that beer has been brewed for God knows how long. And then the same idea, you always steep your grains for 1 hour, you remove them, you go on to the next step on the assumption that all of those times are occurring the way you think they are. So that method takes a lot into account. There are mostly assumptions. The iodine test that I do, where I test the conversion of the starches into fermentable sugars in the grain, I used to just follow the directions. It says steep those grains for 90 minutes. That's what I would do. I would have no idea what percentage or how efficient that process had been. Was it thorough? Was it complete? I didn't have any way of knowing other than the directions said 60 minutes or 90 minutes. That's what I did. That said you're going to get this gravity number, and then when I didn't, I was always confused as to why that was. So I learned over time, disregard some of the time. That's not the determining factor. Same with volumes. Always add X number of liquid to X number of grain, and you're going to end up with this volume, and it's going to make that particular beer. That's not always perfectly true to fact. So someone gave me the advice to disregard the time frame, use it only as a general reference, use a more precise means of measuring that progress rather than time. So the iodine is that. It tells me the percentage or the thoroughness of how much of that grain has been converted to sugar. Someone said, rather than having 5 gallons of average, or maybe even not so average beer, you could have 3 gallons of phenomenal beer. Let the numbers that you're trying to achieve dictate the volumes rather than the volumes leave you guessing with what do you do now when you didn't hit that number. As you do this more often, you tend to get more precise on hitting those numbers anyway. And it gets easier to do and easier to understand where you missed or how to correct things as you go. Now, if you're doing the extract style brewing, it's considerably shorter process. You're heating up your water. Once it starts to boil, you start adding your your extracts and that kind of stuff, and you can have a brew day done in 2 hours from the time you start to the time you've got everything washed up. But if you're going to do the method I do now, which is more in line with what a traditional brewery would use, it's a time-consuming process. Guys that do this for a living work hard. It's not a gentle job sometimes.
So I'm at 1068 somewhere.
Sometimes in the process of making beer, in the boiling process, proteins coagulate on the surface of the wort. You can inadvertently transfer some of that into the fermentation. 9 times out of 10, that's there initially, and that will settle in what they call flocculate. It'll all basically settle to the bottom and form trub, a layer of sediment at the bottom of the fermenter. Sometimes that does not occur, or it's slow to happen. That means that there's either a larger level of particulate that made it into the fermenter. That said, those things tend to clear up over time. If it's other stuff floating on the surface, if it's at all fuzzy, ever, that's mold. Mold is always bad. You can't salvage beer that has mold introduced to it, because that tiny bit of mold that you see is only an indication of a very small portion of what's actually growing in there. Mold is just a symptom of a much larger problem that would indicate poor sanitation, which is by and large the most important thing about brewing beer overall, regardless of what level you do it on. Whether that's homebrew or the highest level of commercial brewing, sanitation is king. I will sanitize every ingredient that's going to come in contact with the finished wort. The fermenter, I will mix up some of that same solution. I will scrub the inside of the fermenter. I will scrub the airlock. Every single thing that comes in contact with the finished boiled beer before it goes in here will be at sometimes sanitized. Now you do the best you can with that. That's not a perfect world. Ideally, the goal is to give the yeast that you prefer the biggest head start, let it outcompete any other things that could be introduced into it. If your cleaning process is relatively thorough, you should be successful with that 99% of the time. You will spend the vast majority of your time brewing, actually cleaning, or paying someone else to clean. But one way or another, everything has to be clean. The consequences of not doing that at different times will be they're astronomical. When you're brewing at home, you make 5 gallons. It doesn't come out perfect. It's not the end of the world. It's a small investment of time and finances, but minimal. If you were brewing 500 gallons or 5,000 gallons and that was a bad choice, you can see the implications there. Now, the wort exits the kettle too hot for the yeast. I have a chiller coil that will go in the kettle, and I'll run water from the garden hose through that. And once it works as a heat exchanger, it's pulling heat away from the wort. And I let that run until the temperature inside the kettle falls to where it stops decreasing. In which case it's the temperature of the garden, or the water coming out of the garden hose can only lower the temperature so far. Once it's hit that spot, then I introduce a second bucket that I fill up with ice, and that further lowers that temperature down by heat exchange, and in which case I'll throw it in here. I can't always add my yeast right away, because say it goes into this fermenter 10 degrees too hot for the yeast. This yeast can handle 90 degrees, so I just have to fall somewhere under that 90 degrees. But we may have to wait. It may have to sit for an hour or two before it cools down.
This looks like soap suds. It is a byproduct of the sanitizer. It is safe to consume. It's not unhealthy in any way. The little residual suds left at the end of rinsing the solution free from the fermenter keep me from adding anything else. Like if I use regular tap water to rinse it clean, I'm reintroducing microbial life forms to that vessel that aren't there before. So the idea is rinse all of the sanitizer free, whatever residual suds you see from the sanitizer itself are not harmful to the beer or harmful to us to consume after the fact. As you'll note on the back of the yeast, chill, unchill, let it warm up, then you shake it for 30 seconds, then clean it in sanitizer before adding it to our wort. As you can see here, we have roughly 3 gallons of saison wort, fresh out of the boil kettle. It's been chilled down to roughly about 75 degrees. I'm going to sanitize this in that acid sanitizer solution, just like the airlock and that kind of stuff, like a critical component in sanitizing it. I'm making sure I'm getting my hands nice and sanitized as well. And goes our yeast.
Do I want liquid or dry yeast?
There's no right answer to that. They both work equally well. The benefits to dry yeast are obvious. It's easy to store. It can be shipped in the mail, so there's tons of simplicity to that. It can be ready whenever you're ready to use it. Liquid yeast are more fragile, they're more shelf life limited, but some styles of yeast are only available as liquid. So if you only use dry yeast, you'd have a limited range, still a big one. There's still tons of styles you can make with dry yeast, but some of the more notable flavors are going to be specific to a liquid yeast.
I almost forgot one key component.
One of my absolute favorite ingredients that was not part of what I used to make before. I never even knew. I love the way oak adds flavor to the beer I make, so much so that it's become an ingredient like everything else. I think of it as just as important as every other thing I add, which I did not think of it like that before. Even though I've learned more to understand things in a different way, traditionally wine and beer both were made in barrels. So they would have always had a barrel, that barrel would have contributed some flavor. Maybe less and less each time that barrel was used, so some barrels would produce a very mild or almost neutral flavor, and that would be intentional or desirable in certain kinds of beer and wine both. Other styles really benefit from the more pungent, additional, or earlier, fresher oak flavor. But that flavor developed over time as a result of it being the perfect material for that job. You could use oak spirals, you could use oak chips to get from all your homebrew suppliers. I, on the other hand, work in an industry where white oak is plentiful, so I bring that home. And I do the math as far as what square-shaped pegs surface area compared to what you get from a spiral or a chip. And I like them better. For once, I know it's super fresh because I cut it. I know which ones smell the best, so I pick those ones to go in the beer. But I like these ones. And from here, this will go into the closet, our pseudo fermentation closet, which is like a little hall closet underneath the stair. It's not usable for a whole bunch of other stuff. And we'll let it sit overnight and see what we get. We'll be looking for some activity tomorrow morning.
In the Harry Potter suite.
Into the closet it goes. Back here. And I will monitor the temperature. I will probably wrap that with a little heating coil because we're right at 70 degrees in the house, and I think this particular yeast will probably taste a little better a little warmer. So we'll see what it does. Come on, dog.
What advice would you give to someone starting out?
I would say research. Get as familiar with everything you can as far as what you'd like to make, read as much as you can. There's excellent books on the subject, some fantastic books that are readily available. But I would do your research. That would be the best advice I could give to someone starting out. And don't be hard on yourself. Give yourself some room. Not everything's going to come out perfect. You'll get there.
And then this is the aftermath. This is the disappointing part of the party. I have all of this to clean up. Everything. I get to scrub the kettle, scrub the mash tun out there still full of grain. All of this stuff, all has to get cleaned up. So that's what I'm gonna do for probably the next hour, maybe a little more. It's the price you pay.